headaches, backaches, shoulder aches, neck aches, knee aches, all those sorts of things. And a quite fascinating conversation there. Now, what we're going to be talking about with Dr. Phil is that he wrote a book called what?
Toxic Bite.
Toxic Bite. Yeah. Let's have a look at it.
Okay. So Toxic Bite, an investigation into tooth decay, or rather truth decay, as I should say. Okay. So not tooth, but truth. Play on words, of course. I'm English. Why wouldn't you do that? The book was published and can still be got through Credence Publications, which is a publication house in the UK. And yeah, I wrote that back in 2002, I think, something like that. Yes.
Okay, tell us a little bit about that book and why you wrote it.
Okay. At the time, I was talking a lot about non-toxic products, healthcare products that were non-toxic, and I had sort of geared myself in that direction. I was approached by Philip Day, who is an author himself, but also the publicist, and he said, "Look, would you write a book on all things toxic in dentistry?" And I said, "Absolutely. It's half finished anyway, so let's get on. Let's get doing that." Now, as I said, 2002, I wrote the book, all very researched. So this was not my opinion. Yes, there are opinion pieces in there, but it really was based on the research that I found on the different topics that we wanted to discuss. And I think that I preface this because it's really important to understand within dentistry that we all have a difference of opinion, and none of what I say makes me right. Okay.
And we all have a difference of opinion, and we can agree or we can agree to disagree, but everyone is allowed to have an opinion. And if you do the research and find the research that is correct, can I say, then that opinion can be taken as real. Yeah. Okay.
So when I looked at it, so again, when I looked at Toxic Bite, one of the things that I was really, really interested in, and I wrote on subsequently, but also within this book, was stress. I talked about stress earlier on. Stress was defined as the non-specific reaction of the body to any demand placed upon it. So you place a demand on the body, on the system, and it will react to it. And it will go from ease to dis-ease, or stress to distress. And as it moves from one to the other, obviously a whole lot of physiological things happen within the body. So that initially I was looking at the distress, if you like, of a poor bite, a bite that wasn't functioning properly, and the impact that had on the body physically. So what was the impact that the bite had? If it wasn't working right, I was seeing headaches, neck aches, backaches, and so on and so forth. So that was how I went into writing this book. I wanted to look at it from what else can stress the body out. You see, if you can reduce the load on the system, then the system will start to deal with the other issues itself. So there are things that I couldn't deal with. For example, if somebody has a lot of financial strife, and that's causing them lots of stress in their life, I couldn't really deal with that. Well, especially as a dentist, most of the time we were taking the money, but I couldn't deal with that. But what I could do was if I could reduce the overall stress on the system, could I help them navigate other bits that I couldn't help them with? And the answer appeared to be yes. So, if you don't have a headache, it's much easier to deal with the other problems you have in your life. You wake up with a headache in the morning. Most of us are cactus. We have no way of functioning through the day. We're no good at work. In fact, the research shows how many days, I can't remember now, how many days lost a year through headaches, neck aches, and back pain. A lot of those can be treated within the dental practice. So then I looked at Toxic Bite. So I wanted to look at the other things that could possibly be feeding into the system. So were we using the right, mouthwash, for example? Were we using a non-alcohol mouthwash? Were we using a mouthwash that wasn't perhaps toxic to the system? Were we using a toothpaste that was not quite so toxic to the system? Because that was important for me to look at as well. Then we looked at the issues around fluoride, and I really don't want to go into that one, but I looked at that issue in depth because water is something that I find fascinating, and I looked at that. I looked at that pre my going to university, and you read about that within the book. And then, so we went through a whole load of different things. We looked at the, the type of filling materials we were using, were possibly toxic to the body. And again, I'm not here to sway anybody anyway. The book does that. From my point of view, it's look, have a conversation with your practitioner and say, look, are you happy with these materials? And the practitioner will say, absolutely, great, because you're not going to find a practitioner who doesn't believe in what they're doing. And doesn't believe in the materials they're using. From my point of view, it was purely and simply, could I reduce the overall stress and load on my patients? And was that going to make a difference to their health? The research seemed to point to the fact that, yes, as long as you reduce toxicity within the system, then you allow the body to heal itself, basically.
And with the fillings and things that they used to use a long time ago, now they remove those and replace them with something else less toxic, because what they were putting in, the amalgam or whatever it was called, was quite toxic, but nobody really knew that at the time, did they? So there wasn't an understanding of that. Or am I touching on something with it that we need to leave alone for now?
Well, no. Okay, so to answer that, if you go back to the beginning of there are still obviously people who believe in mercury-based fillings, and that's I'm not going to argue the toss with that one way or the other. But what I can say is, when I did the research on this, and they started to use quicksilver, which is what mercury is. The great thing about it is it kills everything. So, you can put it into a tooth and that you're not going to get the decay, or it's not going to be as bad. You can get rid of people's pain. So right back 100 years ago plus, they were getting rid of people's pain using quicksilver. So it worked. It broke the American Dental Association of the time, because you had these people who say, you can't possibly use, mercury in a filling, because that, look at Mad Hatters. They went mad because the tanning process is for hat. That's where Mad Hatters come from. You can't possibly put that in. Then you got the other side who say, but it works. We're getting people out of pain, and they keep their teeth, and they can eat, and they can function. So, there was this real argument that went on, as I said, over 100 years ago, and it raged and raged and raged for years. But basically, we didn't have anything else that really worked long term in the mouth either. So you could argue and say, well, this isn't good for the body, but also you could say, but we haven't got another answer. What else are we going to put in? What else are we going to put in there? So that was the argument. And obviously what happens, as happens within all of science, all of life really, if you keep using something for long enough, there comes a time when it's totally acceptable and nobody thinks about it anymore. And then a new wave of, in this case, dentists come along and go, hang on a minute, is this really the best thing we can be doing for the body? And then the argument is resurrected, and off the two sides go again. And that's basically what happened.
So what sort of things, what other things do you have? I mean, there's the chlorine in the water, which yes, is interesting. When I was going to school, this was quite a while ago, we used to have take goiter tablets. I'm thinking, oh, those disgusting little things are only little, but they, stopped that goiter in the throat most of the time, because there was a lack of the minerals or whatever our bodies were needing. But we've become more educated now to make sure that we have all the vitamins and minerals and everything that we have in our bodies. And talking about water, we know, as you know very well, the water that we drink and the water that we can drink, there's two different things, and the effects on your body and all the rest of it, which is a really important thing for everyone to understand. When you're drinking tap water, if you're turning on the tap and you've got a sensitive nose, you can smell the chlorine and everything in it, and it's absolutely disgusting. If you're drinking filtered water, it's better than tap water, but then there's something a level above that we might talk about in the second half. But what other things in your book is there that people need to be aware of when they go to the dentist?
Okay, well, let me just come back just on that bit about the iodine, which is what you're talking about with goiter. And my take on that really is very much when you go back to your chemistry class, if you did chemistry, and you look at the halogens in the electrochemical series, and you know which ones replace which. So you got fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. So the ones at the top will replace the ones at the bottom, because that's just the way that the whole thing works. Well, it did when I was doing chemistry. I presume it still works that way, unless I got it wrong back there. So, okay, so what you're really saying is that if you've got chlorine in the water, chances are that you may well be not having the iodine there in the same proportion. Having said that, I believe totally that chlorine needs to be in the water all the way to the point where I turn on the tap. At that point, it doesn't need to be in my body, but I believe that it's the best way still to keep our water as clean as we possibly can. Within Toxic Bite, coming back to the book, because I now have to look because it was a long time ago, I think the other things that, okay, I was talking to a colleague just recently. Now, here's an important fact, really. When I qualified, we were not really aware of the link between gum disease and heart disease. Okay. But now we are far more aware of the link between gum disease, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and so on and so forth. Or to look at it another way, the diseases of inflammation. Now, one of the largest sources of inflammation in the body is the mouth. According to one of the American academies, they say, the biggest source of inflammation is from the mouth. How about we deal with that? In fact, and there's research that shows that some of the bacteria that we find in the mouth also shows up in the placenta. So we've now got to have a look at what are we doing here. And so when if you've got young couples who are wanting to have children, how about they make sure that they go to their dentist and they really, really get their gum health totally under control. And that's what dentists and dental hygienists or hygienists in general are really, really good at, is let's get this whole thing under control. Do I think it's important? I think it's of paramount importance that we have good gum health. Absolutely. And if you don't, then you put yourself at risk, but also you can put your whole family at risk as well. So I think that, and I do highlight that in the book when we look at it, and I call it, I can't remember what I call it, something, typically me, camel breath and bleeding gums, but really, really important. And if people don't think that they need to go and see the dentist, that for me is one of the most important things that you can do, is to make sure, back in the day, tribal systems, before you were allowed to conceive, some tribes would put you on a diet for a couple of years, male and female. You see, oftentimes when we think about the health of the baby, we think about the mum. But we should be looking at the dads as well and say, you're half the equation here. What bacteria have you got floating around in your system? How clean and healthy are you? So before we just put it all onto the poor mum, we say no. We need good health from both partners, best as we possibly can, to ensure that the best health for the baby is what I believe.
And how many people would know that or understand that? Not a lot.
No, look, all dentists do, and I think we're a lot firmer on that than we used to be. I think that gradual, when I wrote Toxic Bite, we talked about gum disease and rheumatic fever. So we knew, but even as a student, if you had rheumatic fever as a child, then it was common practice back in the day to treat the patient with antibiotics for any dental treatment whatsoever, because what we didn't need was anything lodging into the valves of the heart and causing further problems. We've moved on from there now to understand that bigger approach that's come out. It wasn't really out so much in 2002 when I wrote the book, but certainly now there's a plethora of information on the power of gum disease. And you have specialists, as we do up in Queensland. You've got specialists who are periodontists, and that's their job, to make sure that your mouth is absolutely pristine. And hats off to them. It's an amazing contribution to the general health of people,
their health and well-being.
Yeah.
What about gingivitis? What causes that? Because that's a gum disease.
It's the same. So that's the very first part. What I'm talking about is when you move from gingivitis. So that's the inflammation of the gums. A lot of that is just due to poor oral hygiene technique, making not keeping your mouth as clean as you should. There are conditions as well that your dentist or your periodontist will talk to you about that can cause that, make it worse. Some of the autoimmune problems, also things like lichen planus can feed into that. But it's really when you come to the periodontal issues, when you start to lose bone, the gum starts to shrink down around the teeth, that we have some rather bigger problems that really do need to be addressed.
That's very interesting. So I think everyone needs to get a copy of Toxic Bite and have a read of it. Can you show it again so that people on Facebook can see it? Toxic Bite by Bill Kellner Read. And what's the tagline again?
An investigation into truth decay. And if people want to know where they can get this book, by the way, I think I don't know that it's available here in Australia any longer, but they just have to look up Credence Publications. And Credence has a lot of good, Philip's got some great books.
Great books. And how many books have you written so far? Because we're going to talk about a couple of those later, but how many have you written?
2, 3, 4, 5.
Right. I think I've read 2 of those so far.
Right. Well,
and
you probably didn't read this one.
Oh, yes, I did.
Oh, did you?
Yes, I did. The children's book. It was fabulous. I loved it. Yeah. And I can't remember the name of the other one, but when you show me them again, I will remember.
Yeah.
So to give advice to people who don't go to the dentist very often, what would you say to them?
Go. I would say go. One of the things that I found, look, in the UK, although the system seems to be breaking down, which is really sad, in the UK, once you become pregnant, your dental treatment is free. And there are a lot of people in categories where dental treatment is still free today. I know that it's expensive. One of the things that really impressed me when I came to Australia was how well people managed their money in terms of making sure they had enough to be able to come and see us, come and see dentists. So back in 87, 88, when I first got here, health funds were there, but I didn't really have a lot to do with them. I didn't really understand the whole thing. It was just, it was foreign to me. But I was amazed at the number of people who came in and you'd say, look, this is what we need to do. And they said, yeah, that's fine. I have put money aside for that. And I think when you look at it, once you get into a program with your dentist, oftentimes you're seeing the hygienist rather than the dentist, and he or she is dealing with these issues. And I just think once you get into the program and you get going and it's a part of your life, are really important. If you really struggle with it, then obviously there's some other things that you need to be doing.
Yeah, beautiful. Excellent. Well,